Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a great event today. We just were discussing that maybe we're having Michael Jackson, but no, we're having Rem Koolhaas, and he's going to tell you something about Russia, Russia for beginners, and he is one of such beginners. That's the topic of the lecture that Rem is going to give today. I guess I don't really have to say anything about him because you know a lot about him. That's why you came. And after the lecture, we're going to have questions and answers sessions with Kate Fowle, our chief curator, and that's when you can ask all kinds of questions. So this is it. Rem, you're welcome.
Okay. I deliberately didn't listen to the translation of Anton because I knew he would talk about Michael Jackson. Anyway, can have a little bit less light, maybe no light there. Anyway, I'm going to talk about Russia for beginners. And what the lecture is about is simply my entire relationship with Russia and Russian culture. And therefore, it is in part an autobiography, but of course a very limited autobiography, because I could also give a lecture, Germany for beginners or China for beginners. But the point of the lecture is to really give you a kind of very precise and honest account of every moment in which Russia was either important for me personally, for my development, and every moment where I tried to do something kind of in return for Russia. And as you will see, there is a lot of back and forth, a lot of interaction. And so therefore, if you come to the end of the lecture, you will realize that Russia has been an essential country for me and for the whole development of my sensibility. But it also means that this is a particular lecture that is not linear, not very coherent, but as random and as accidental as life itself. So I'm not pretending that this is a kind of large composition. I'm simply kind of showing you each moment that Russia was important and each moment that I intersected with Russia. And I think that simply is perhaps interesting for you to not listen to a seamless story or an official story, but to a kind of crude reality and random reality that has defined Russia for me. Anyway, my father was a writer, and that meant that the entire translated Russian library, all the Russian writers of the 19th century, were in our bookshelves or on our bookshelves. And between my 11th and my 15th birthday, I actually did nothing but read, and I read all the kind of Russian writers from the beginning to end. And I'm not saying to boast it, but I'm saying that I grew up in a culture where kind of being familiar with kind of Russian literature was crucial, and I didn't feel it was an obligation. It was kind of really an incredible adventure that kind of resonated with me in kind of on many levels. And which I think was one of the first elements that kind of defined for me the space of imagination. So apart from the politics, apart from any other issue, for me Russia is a crucial country in terms of understanding, in any case, what imagination even is. And also what is special about Russia is the kind of relationship between the reality of Russia and how that reality is constantly imagined and kind of recycled by Russian artists. And I hope that in that sense I am partly Russian too. I grew up in Amsterdam in part, and in Amsterdam there was a museum, the Stedelijk Museum. It was a kind of very modest little building, as you can see, where the exhibitions were held. And the museum director was a certain Sandberg, a legend in terms of what curators can do. And he had a very particular relationship with Malevich and with the Russian avant-garde. So again, between the age of 11 and the age of 16, I was almost daily in this museum, and therefore deeply familiar with the painting of Malevich, but also the avant-garde in the forms of exhibitions on Tatlin, on and on other Russians that really created a kind of double intimacy, not only literature but also your avant-garde. When I was 18, I became a journalist, and I was particularly interested in film. So here you see me kind of interviewing Federico Fellini, the Italian movie maker, and I also wrote scripts. So I was basically preparing a career in movies, and because I had made some. Thank you. And because I had begun to make some movies when I was 23, I was invited by a group of young architects, architecture students, who wanted to see my movies and who wanted me to give a presentation on movies. And so I went to Delft, where the Technical University is, the main school of architecture at the time. And basically I gave my lecture about movies, but then I asked them, what are you doing and what are you working on? And it turned out that they were working on a show on Russian constructivism, and that was the first time I actually saw some of the proposals constructivists made. And this was, for me, a kind of particularly striking example. In a way, it was incredibly minimalistic and simplistic. It was a kind of individual cell for a single person with a balcony and a window that either disappears in the summer or reappears in the summer. And it was put on stilts. So there was nothing particularly interesting about it in terms of architecture. But what was unbelievably interesting to me is that it was part of a proposition that I could, as a scriptwriter, only see as a script, but not a script for the movies, but a script for the country or a script for the city of Moscow. Because all those individual cells were kind of supposed to create a kind of chain of cells, and occasionally that chain would be kind of interrupted by kind of building that contained a number of collective facilities. And I think the script here was that kind of every Russian would have such a cell that Russians could combine with other people, maybe even have children, but still then that would mean that you would have 2 cells or 3 cells. The point is I have to look at this and speak, so you should do it in a way that, yeah. Thank you. So I basically read this as a very radical script, a script not only to kind of redefine the city, but also to redefine family life and the whole structure of civilization. And as a scriptwriter, I kind of suddenly had a revelation that kind of maybe I should not become a filmmaker, but that architecture was perhaps a much more interesting domain because it enabled you to write scripts, but without the apparent triviality of filmmaking, which is only kind of fiction, but with the potential reality of also realizing those scripts in the real world. So I can say that kind of without Russia, I would never have been an architect or had the kind of idea of becoming an architect, and it was kind of really this very simplistic and architecturally negligible little cell, but this impressive scenario that kind of really made the difference for me. And of course, such a scenario, as you can see here, was supposed to eventually do away with the city of Moscow and kind of replace it by endless amount of bands going through kind of real landscape, maybe a kind of vision for the city which at this moment is kind of particularly attractive still, even though it's 100 years old. So, as I said, without Russia, I would never have been an architect, and then, of course, I became interested in what kind of culture, what kind of educational system could kind of realize this kind of dream. And of course, I was also kind of very aware that this was an architecture that was the direct result of the Russian Revolution, so that there was a very interesting political dimension, and that this kind of drastic transformation was happening, of course, in countries that were, you know, politically going extremely radical change. I was soon looking at the Woetermas and kind of realizing that the Woetermas was an incredibly sophisticated school in the sense that it was able to pick students not only from the kind of urban elite, but actually really from across the whole of Russia, very often from the countryside, and deal with architecture and with form in a very systematic way, almost separate from program. I think that these were exercises in balance, and that therefore it was a school that with amazing efficiency was able to turn normal people or gifted people, but from all walks of way and from all kinds of cultures, many of them from Siberia, and turn them in relatively kind of quick way into artists/architects. Here are some of the kind of products. And as you will see, these were studies in balance. As you will see, you know, in my own work, there's an almost direct and simplistic and maybe even embarrassing kind of relationship with these examples that were only 100 years old. I became particularly fascinated by a figure called Leonidov, Ivan Leonidov, who was one of those kind of prototypes, living in Siberia, trained as an icon painter, and then immediately after the revolution picked out as a gifted person, invited to Moscow, and very quickly turning into a star, not only in the school, but also in the field of international architecture, with his project for the Lenin Institute, which was basically characterized by a kind of a kind of media sphere that broadcast the entire institution, so a very modern idea, a tower of books, an auditorium for community, and a cable car that kind of went from the Lenin Hills straight into Red Square or the Kremlin. So again, a kind of very beautiful imagination, a beautiful kind of building, and a very direct connection between media, politics, and shape, which is perhaps are the three ingredients that we are kind of currently having to work with. Before I went to Russia, I also kind of learned that what was unique about Leonidov's drawings is that he made white lines on black. And initially we all thought that was a kind of form of aesthetics or aesthetic preference. But in fact, it turned out to be the kind of direct result of the speed with which he was working. So his typical way of presenting a competition, like in this case, is to draw on blackboard, like a schoolmaster with chalk, with white lines. So it's not an aesthetic, but it's simply literally the result of the speed drawings and projects made overnight in this kind of very unusual in architecture kind of medium. What was also beautiful for me is, and which is still kind of something I'm very seduced by and sensitive to, is that he almost had no formal, at that time in any case, almost no formal imagination. Everything is incredibly simple. These are a living unit. You see the kind of bedrooms here in the corner, cruciform, void, living room, kind of tropical garden, but also exercise, of course. And all of it kind of represented without any extras or any loss of time. So this is what I knew about Russia after a year of wanting to be an architect. And then again, before I went to architecture school, I came to Moscow because what I had decided with my friends is to write a book about Ivan Leonidov. So before we came to Moscow, of course, we had a kind of fantasy of Moscow, a really amazing kind of city with a kind of glow, and the Kremlin. We knew that that was the most kind of important thing. But actually, what I found in Moscow was absolutely the opposite. A really unbelievably simple life, which was very different from life in the West at the time, and which had a certain beauty. And what I kind of began to realize about communism is that you can look at it as a kind of revolutionary kind of system, but also everything that it doesn't change remains the same. So where other kind of societies actually kind of move maybe altogether from one condition to another, it seemed that here either things were kept or they were completely transformed. And so that connection between communism and preservation was a kind of early hint. Also, if you looked at the streets, they were amazingly empty. The kind of dimensions of public space were as big as I'd ever seen, and bigger than I could have possibly kind of imagined at the time. But the life in the street was therefore seemingly almost absent. But of course, that absence was not real, because there had been incredible forms of contents. There were almost choreographed, almost ballets of occupying these enormous spaces in the forms of parades, and that tradition, of course, kind of remained one of the ways in which the city was animated, and in which these enormous vast spaces were used for ceremonial conditions. And that for somebody coming from a society where the whole idea of a ceremony as part of urban life was kind of almost completely absent. So again, it was a revelation. And so for me, from that moment on, Russia became a constant sequence of revelations, many of them happening to break my own kind of prejudices. Of course, I had ideas about Russia, ideas about how things ought to be, how they ought to be kind of organized. But Russia contradicted almost every one of them, and therefore expanded my own sensibility. Another form of content was, of course, the political decoration everywhere. And this was the kind of view from my bedroom, hotel room, the Kremlin in the snow, unbelievably cold, Lenin's mausoleum, and an endless queue of people who were going to kind of look at Lenin or encounter Lenin, very often in their kind of bridal gowns as one of the key moments in Soviet life. So for me, again, very impressive to see how these empty spaces were not really empty, but how they were used for public life that, of course, was partly political. Anyway, architects are extremely narrow, and their interests are very narrow. Their interests are mostly architecture. So when we were in Moscow, the first thing we wanted to see is kind of modern architecture, because that was what our official interest was. So we went to see at the Ginsburg Conference building. You see it here. And so this is the drawing, and this is the building, kind of huge similarity. And of course, as kind of real architecture freaks, we were particularly interested in the corridor, in the section, a corridor that served both two apartments, one above it and one below it, a kind of section that later was used by Le Corbusier in Marseille and made Le Corbusier famous. So as a typical architect, we went to look at the corridor, at the slab, at the corridor. And at that time, you could not move as a tourist freely through Moscow, so we had an architectural guide, a very kind lady. But the lady was totally desperate that we wanted to see this building because she thought it was extremely ugly, neglected, uninteresting. And so when we were in the courtyard, she almost cried, "Why do you want to see this building if we also have this kind of building?" Yeah? And so that was that why was a crucial question for me, because I also kind of wondered, you know, why am I looking at this and not at that? And is it maybe more interesting to look at that? And so then I started to look at that, and that was in a way the beginning of a discrepancy with my friends, because they really disapproved of this other interest. An interest which is maybe kind of more anecdotal or more literary in the kind of story, not in the shapes of architecture, but in the stories of architecture. And then I kind of realized that this building was dedicated to aviators and test pilots, and that there was even a rumor that Gagarin lived there. And that created for me a kind of very special aura, of course, but also a connection to one of the kind of earlier myths of constructivism, that gravity could be superseded and that kind of somehow sooner or later elements could float. So in spite of the kind of monumentality of the building, it was also dedicated at least or inhabited by people who were overcoming gravity, and that became an interesting tension. So not only there was a kind of obsession with the sky, but what was also completely surprising and stunning to me is the kind of was the Russian Moscow metro. And one of the most surprising elements was how dogmatic and pure its diagram was, because of course all cities are networks, and so the ideal kind of diagram for a metro line is a kind of more or less a grid or a network. And so this is absolutely the opposite, basically a series where all lines lead to the center, and that emphasizes a kind of centrality. But I'm now talking about kind of 64, 65. It also looked to me as a surprisingly efficient way of applying iconography. Iconography was becoming important in the West. Of course, we did not have political symbols, or we had very weak political symbols, but people in France, like Roland Barthes, was beginning to write about how everything means something and how important it is to look at icons and to look at symbols in our urban life. And in that context, the metro seemed unbelievably efficient as a kind of system to deliver iconographic messages, because it was efficient, because everybody needed to use it. So everyone during their day was kind of almost exposed to the same symbols, the same stories, and the same language. And that language, even underground, was also about kind of floating, disappearing from the earth, overcoming gravity. And in other words, even the underground was an enormous space of the imagination. Maybe many of these things are sounding offensive to you as an audience who has lived through all these situations. And maybe you think it is very superficial for somebody to come and enjoy what other people may have suffered. And I apologize for that if it is the case. But on the other hand, I also simply can record the effect on myself and on my sensibility of all these ideas. So I share my thinking with you, even though it is not officially kind of my position or my, or what I would necessarily defend. But that is, of course, the beauty of the unconscious and the conscious, that it's not politically correct, and that it takes liberties in association, connection, and insight that are not following the kind of official path. So for me, it was stunning to see this kind of iconography, you know, deep into the earth, and in a kind of very generated by a very harsh political system. So talking about harshness, there was, of course, I knew this kind of monument, but what was stunning is to see again another story, how that monument had been started but not finished because of the war, and how now it had been turned into a kind of swimming pool, which of course we visited in the heart of the kind of winter, and which is an incredible experience that I'm not going to repeat here, but again it was a kind of stunning reality to be told that this regime was dedicated to this kind of architecture, and then to discover that actually it had been translated into kind of maximum of hedonism in the heart of the city at a scale that I could kind of barely comprehend. I think the kind of section was, the diameter was 200 meters. All this change, this, let's say, the pressure, of course, the initial attempts by the constructivists to modernize the system and the kind of counter pressure against that, wanted to introduce other aesthetics and more monumental aesthetics and presumably more popular aesthetics that could be enjoyed by larger sections of the population, let's say the language of socialist realism, also affected Leonidov. And the standard story in the kind of West was, of course, that certain architects were kind of forced to change their style, their nature, and to start kind of working in a different language. I think that, and that is true of architecture in general, architecture works under many forces, and the best architects are not struggling with those forces or not simply kind of opposing those forces, but are working with them. And I think that Leonidov was one of the people that clearly, in my view, and that was the thesis of our book, worked within and with and engaged this new political obligation in a way that was still creative. And so in the book I made a reconstruction of a project he did for Red Square, Dom na Kamchaspom. And here you see one of the sketches, which is clearly an attempt, here is his tower, to kind of relate it to Russian history, to the aesthetic of St. Basil's Cathedral, to kind of mix glass and old-fashioned monuments with gold and other elements. And here is a model I made for the Museum of Modern Art, kind of, which was based on a kind of research. And basically, what my theory was is that for Leonidov, straight angles were the angles of the past, and roundness was an indication of the future. And that kind of since Red Square, which is kind of here in front, is a kind of historical condition, and the Kremlin obviously is historical, that basically he confronted it with kind of rectangular shapes in the first line, and with rectangular, with straight planes in the second line, and that if round was the future, then the future was hidden behind a kind of rectangular element, and basically the curves here kind of reflected a round shape, so that you could read this project as a kind of unfolding of history. And if you look at it here, then you see that the materials also were, in that sense, kind of semantic plausibility. The Kremlin was, what faced the Kremlin was clad in stone, and this plane also in stone, and then there was green glass and black glass kind of behind it. And so in every sense, both in terms of shape and in terms of materials, it was a project as if history was unfolding. And so for me that was Leonidas' way of kind of relating to the edicts or the kind of new rules of socialist realism. And then when we moved kind of further into his life, and when we also encountered the family, also in the 60s, we discovered that there were other dimensions to Leonidov, and that kind of somewhere in the late 30s he had reapplied his knowledge as an icon painter, the training he received in Siberia, and was kind of creating visions for the Crimea that were kind of almost like fairy tales, with kind of pavilions on the hills, kind of flower beds and kind of sanatoria, and some kind of pleasure zone arranged according along the whole of the Crimea. So again, in my view, not kind of compromise the architecture, but a kind of extension of his kind of initial mentality, and produced with a kind of genuine and exceptional beauty and elegance in my eyes. So all of that was kind of in a very short period, kind of something in terms of confronting my own prejudices as an architect to look only at modern architecture, or as an architect to only look at kind of issues like sections, to ignore culture completely and to ignore the larger narrative within which architecture plays a role. And so I can say that I have to be grateful to Russia for extending kind of my mentality. But of course there was another kind of story that as I moved as a student by that time in the late 60s and moved to New York in the early 70s, that by looking at socialist realism and at looking at an obligation to deal with the past, I also became kind of aware early of the same mentality that was later in Europe and America kind of named postmodernism. So there was a strange resonance between socialist realism and postmodernism. Both, in a way, had the kind of same aesthetics, but of course totally different ideologies. The postmodernism was an ideology of consumerism, kind of making things more attractive in order to sell them better. And socialist realism was, of course, entirely ideological, about making things accessible to the people. But anyway, having experienced the kind of Russian story, I was better able to understand and also be active against postmodernism. Anyway, I already mentioned that by the early 70s I was in New York, but you would say there was a kind of total contradiction between being interested in Russia and being interested in America, but actually it was not that difficult to associate some of the shapes of constructivism or some of the shapes of Malevich to New York, in the sense that the tectonics of Malevich in many ways resonated, of course, with architectural form here in Moscow. Maybe resonated even with the kind of intricacy of some of the Stalinist architecture, but were also very similar with the architectural language of America at the time. There's a kind of very enormous kind of similarity in the 30s between Stalinism and Art Deco architecture in America. So again, I was very much able to connect between the two worlds. And I started to write a book about New York. The book about Leonidov so far has not been finished. And in looking at the architecture of New York, I discovered that there was not only a kind of formal similarity between the two architectural languages, but that there had actually been contacts between New York architects and Soviet architects that had inspired certain elements in New York. This is a laboratory of sleep by Konstantin Melnikov, which proposed dormitories built on slopes but with music, birds, sounds, but also with an air conditioning system that was used to induce kind of special kinds of sleep. And I discovered that New York clients and New York architects had visited Moscow, had encountered Melnikov, his name was Wallace Harrison, and actually in building Radio City Music Hall, decided to make Radio City Music Hall like a Melnikov dormitory. Basically it was based on the idea of a sunset, so here the sunrise and sunset, but also in the initial periods, the control of the air conditioning systems in Radio City Music Hall actually used the same synthetic gases that Melnikov had kind of proposed for his workers' dormitory. So I was incredibly happy and excited that there actually was a literal connection and that there was a similarity or a contact, an intersection of these two worlds. As I wrote Delirious New York became more and more obsessed with postmodernism. And so as a kind of protest, and at the end of the book, I wrote one story, which was a story about a swimming pool. And in the story, which was clearly based on Leonidov, I mentioned that the Russian architects had built a swimming pool, totally rectangular, not interesting as a shape, but very interesting as a kind of program. And that they had discovered that kind of by swimming kind of very regularly in one direction, the pool would move slowly to in the opposite direction. And that when in the 30s, the kind of situation in Moscow became difficult for architects, they decided to use the pool to escape to New York. But it took a long time because it was not very fast, so they arrived only in the 70s, old men. By that time, and here you see the kind of moment of arrival, and you see that kind of at that point, the rectangle of the pool kind of encounters the rectangle of the World Trade Center, which at the time I thought was a kind of directly related to Leonidov's kind of purity, and so this was my polemic with postmodernism, thinking that this was the real architecture and postmodernism was kind of somehow fake. Anyway, so this is all my entire relationship with New York until, let's say, the 80s. I published Delirious New York in 78. So that was one chapter of a relationship with Russia, where you can see that my entire sensibility was kind of really stretched, and that particularly a number of surprises and in Russia dramatic events and dramatic turning points enabled me to kind of stretch and modify my own simplistic visions and kind of really extended it and gave me a kind of much wider kind of repertoire and much wider frame of reference to look at the world of architecture. And of course, this is in a way, let's say, the phasing of my career and how architecture has a kind of number of phases. So I'm now no longer talking as a student or as a kind of researcher or as a kind of free free person, free individual. I actually became an architect, and that means enormous amount of obligations, a structure of an office, and at some point also teaching in Harvard, which is of course the absolute opposite of the initial freedom that you have as an architect. But I used these structures, I think, to continue an engagement with Russia and my interest in Russia. And one of the things I did with my Harvard project on the city, which kind of looked at shopping, looked at China, is to look at communism and to make a comparison between the 20th century development in America and in Russia, which we called Tales of Communism. It hasn't been published, but it might be published at some point. So as a kind of narrative and as a kind of really almost literary short stories, it contains a number of elements kind of simply to explain this unbelievable kind of situation that this monument was partly built and then looked like this, and that now this is there. I think that outside Russia, everyone reads this as a kind of as a completely incomprehensible and implausible fairy tale. But for me, it is a fantastic story that fairy tales actually happen. And whether you're happy with the outcome or not, it is at least a kind of very strong point that fairy tales can happen. Another fairy tale was this one, that I also discovered kind of more or less at the same time. Russian architects after the war were asked to build on one of the boulevards a kind of building for the generals who were also coming back from the war. And so basically, because architects are a lot less powerful than generals, they kind of surreptitiously and almost secretly planned an attic where all the architects, or many of the architects coming back from the war, could also be housed. So basically from here to here, the building was formerly a general's building, and only this attic was a kind of architect's attic. And the architects kind of built the building with German labor, German slave labor, and that meant that they were building the building with Nazis, former Nazis, and that since there were no kind of production lines, the slave labor was asked to create ornaments, and that the only kind of ornament they kind of could imagine was kind of ornaments that they had seen in Germany and under the Nazis. So here, the architects going back from the war, working with German slave labor, kind of reproducing German detail in a Stalinist building. That alone already quite a complex story. But then this was the plan of the attic, and since there was not planned as a single argument, but as storage spaces, there was no corridor. And that meant that each architect every morning needed to travel through every apartment on his way to the exit. So I was told this story by kind of some of the children of the architects who told me that kind of every morning they saw a whole row of architects going to their work, passing through the kitchen. And the funny result of this exposure was that almost all the children of the architects also had decided to become architects. At that time, so in the same series of kind of stories about kind of Soviet architecture, I was also kind of confronted again with the Narkomfin building, but with kind of terrible kind of results of the market economy. The Narkomfin building had been kind of rented by Cassina, the Italian furniture company. They had given an incredible party on the roof and left the roof kind of more wrecked and more ruined than ever before, so that after surviving 40 years of neglect, the market economy then kind of accelerated the neglect, and that seemed to me kind of in itself again a beautiful kind of allegorical tale about Russia. So those were stories about Russia that I wrote as an architect and kind of with my researchers. So it was more a result of Russia than an exploration of Russia. Another engagement with Russia was happened in Petersburg. This was the square in front of the Hermitage Museum in '67. Again, almost intimidating in its emptiness. An emptiness that I had never kind of seen before, experienced before, and also an emptiness that kind of in our own architectural work was very important, because Russia confronted me with a kind of an insight that emptiness could be as important as fullness, and that in many ways it was easier to realize emptiness than to realize enormous amounts of architecture. So in a certain way, I think the use of emptiness in our work, which is a key theme and a key strategy. Would never have happened without Russia either. Anyway, the Hermitage. Again, through a total fluke that started in America and a relationship with Tom Krantz, the then director of the Guggenheim, I was asked to design in Las Vegas, the opposite of St. Petersburg, a pavilion for the Hermitage Museum that was kind of basically put like a knife in a kind of postmodern museum. And for that reason, I kind of became acquainted first and then friends with Petrovsky, the Hermitage Museum. Here you see the two of us kind of turning a wall in this museum in Las Vegas. And so therefore, ever since, we've been kind of working on the Hermitage, not necessarily in terms of doing architecture for the Hermitage, but simply in terms of strategizing how the Hermitage could be developed over time and what would be the kind of important things to kind of relate the Hermitage to, and how an enormous institution like the Hermitage can avoid some of the kind of more commercializing kind of forces and pressures that major museums in the West have experienced, and where, for instance, a kind of museum like the Museum of Modern Art is kind of simply unrecognizable in terms of its initial beginnings, simply because. So this is one thing that we are constantly strategizing, and that is then kind of an engagement with Russia as a kind of professional. We are writing in a way the script for the Hermitage rather than the architecture. And one effort we are introducing and working on is to undo some of the kind of current condition of the Hermitage, where every single element of the Hermitage, and initially a palace, a museum for the Tsars, a kind of public museum, and a theater, that is now experienced in a kind of single trajectory, almost as a kind of form of tourism, where you never know when you're inside in which kind of section of the museum you actually operate, and where you can see the entire museum maybe in an hour and a half, which implies that you actually don't see anything, and that you actually do not take the time or can take the time, because you're basically pushed on this trajectory by the thousands of inhabitants, to undo that kind of connectedness and to re-insist on the individual character of each component, which also enables you to kind of show and talk more about the kind of history of the complex, and not simply see it as a kind of container of art. So this is one of the things. You will probably never see it in terms of a kind of architectural result, but maybe over time experiencing it as a kind of shift in emphasis. So again, in that sense, Russia has enabled me a kind of unique experience as a kind of, in a way, more a script writer than an architect. So it was very logical when I was asked to launch the Strelka Institute to say yes, because it became a kind of fascinating re-engagement kind of with Russia and with kind of Russian issues, and again, for me, very important to test out kind of certain directions and certain intuitions that I had at the time. And apart from that, it was a totally unprecedented opportunity to start something from scratch, and therefore to conceptualize something from the beginning. And so very soon we decided to make it a research-based institution that could basically try to realize certain intentions, kind of rather than and create an intelligence about how to operate in the real world, kind of rather than teach people kind of design or anything as relatively simple as that. By the time I had become myself kind of very interested in preservation. The reason is that architects, and particularly star architects in the kind of recent decades, have been forced by external forces to emphasize the spectacular, the exceptional, and the unusual, and therefore, in our own work, but also in our own kind of thinking, we are very interested in going into a kind of different counter direction. So preservation is one of those areas where you immediately declare that you are not the author, and that you are in a way at the service of somebody who existed before you, that to some extent it will be a kind of collaboration, very often between a person who doesn't exist anymore and a person who is still alive, a collaboration, and that therefore the kind of result is more complex than it ever can be in the case you're alone. What I wanted to try to preserve, and what became one of the efforts at Strelka, is this condition. This is basically a section of Moscow. It's the Khrushchev Moscow, concrete buildings based on panels. But of course, something that Khrushchev could never anticipate is the incredible quality of the kind of spaces in between, the kind of park, and the unusual density of layers of kind of very simple architecture and nature. I showed in the beginning this city, which was kind of cabins in the landscape. This is again, in the first instance, a landscape. And of course, every single force in current society is dedicated to erasing this condition, to eliminate it, because the architecture is ugly, the kind of urbanism is ugly, and there is no sensibility that can kind of see the kind of virtues of this. I mean, and that seems to be a kind of worldwide phenomenon, that architecture, all architecture of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, is in almost every country in danger. So what we decided to try is to write one of these sections into the UNESCO World Heritage System. And the way we did it is to look at Prigov, who had been conceptual artist in kind of Moscow in the 70s, and who lived in one of these sections, to see if we could kind of basically recognize Prigov's residence as a kind of UNESCO world site. And we made the application. The application is still going on, and what it meant is that, you know, UNESCO would kind of, from this condition, evolve into that condition, which at the same time would be a kind of modernization of UNESCO themselves. So what Strelka enabled us is to train a number of people in those kind of conceptual kind of operations. In the same way, we felt that Lushkov era would later be recognized as an era of the same, not importance aesthetically. It's obviously kind of a very brutal era, but kind of for that reason also interesting in terms of thinking of it in terms of preservation. This complex is kind of really incomprehensible, unfinished complex, but I think for the understanding the history of Moscow and of Russia, a key complex to try to preserve. Preservation of this kind of thing is almost unthinkable in the world, so I could use Strelka as kind of part of an argument that preservation should not always be beautiful things, important things, historical things, but also kind of ugly realities that without that kind of protections are doomed to disappear from the face of the earth. Another kind of thing we did for Strelka, and this was kind of really a deep engagement with Russia itself, almost in its entirety, looking at a phenomenon we called thinning, which is based on an enormous extension of an area covered, in this case Russia as a kind of urban or as a nation and as a civilization, as a population, with a decreasing intensity of use. So the bigger you become, and in Russia there's a shrinking population, so the fewer people inhabit that area, so the lower the density, and that is also an issue in civilization. So this was a kind of beautiful example of it. This is the network of airlines and all the destinations served in '87. This is it now. So basically, the large part of the Russia have been kind of abandoned in terms of this kind of access, with all the consequences of that. So what we try to do, and with a kind of strange and unique kind of forms of civilization, of effects in society, this is one of the academic cities that has been almost completely abandoned. But the former inhabitants meet there once a year and camp out there so that they can reconstitute kind of some of their earlier communities from the Soviet Union. For me, again, a phenomenon that almost no one has kind of really described, but that is crucial to understand Russia. So what we try to do is kind of basically almost randomly describe a point grid of points in Russia that we wanted to document and understand in order to get a picture, full picture of the Russian hinterland. So it would meant kind of visiting places like this, not exactly kind of familiar place, where of course there is an enormous kind of effort at maintaining, if not creating, traditions. This is an example. And places like this, Vladivostok, the kind of most eastern point of Russia, which is actually undergoing an incredible cocktail of influences from China, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Japan, and where a radically new tradition or new culture is kind of happening, with the phenomenon of kind of interconnection and in a scale that hasn't happened kind of before in Russia, and also creating cocktails of kind of import-export. So what is, of course, fascinating by Russia is that the scale alone implies, on the one hand, this isolation, but that the enormous perimeter also implies an endless series of encounters with other conditions. And what we wanted to capture is how these two simultaneously operate and work. I'm getting to the end of my lecture. I'm sure you've experienced the incoherence or unplannable life of how you cannot really plan a life, but when you have a kind of certain interest, you can at least incorporate every one of your operations in that interest. What has been kind of very exciting is to, as a director of the this year's Biennale in Venice, to witness the Russian pavilion conceived by Strelka, and by far the most ingenious kind of pavilion in the entire collection, where Strelka, and this is for me an enormous and impressive effort, in a couple, less than a decade, turned and was able to kind of really present one of the most intelligent, cynical, funny, and in a way shocking pavilions. The Russian history disguised as a trade fair, with every single episode of Russian history, architectural history, both sold and kind of presented as part of a kind of contemporary, slick consultant language. So here, you know, the aesthetic speaks for itself. There was a fantastic video with some of our, you know, former students, with total conviction, pronouncing the most kind of nonsensical but still realistic language, a perfect caricature of how completely unreliable the current moment is, and therefore presenting a fantastically sophisticated face of Russia. at this very moment, where that is kind of in itself very interesting. So I now come to the reason that I'm here. Of course, as a kind of cocktail or a mixture of all these elements, it's kind of unbelievably exciting to do the garage in Moscow, here, and in doing so, to convert a Soviet piece of architecture, a restaurant from '68 into a museum. Because it enables me to do many things and to integrate in kind of one effort a number of different interests, not only Russia, but also preservation, also collaboration, also kind of art spaces, and to see how we can accommodate and maintain the generosity of Soviet planning of the day, kind of large spaces kind of dedicated to the people, kind of presumably, how we can kind of maintain that as a part of the quality of the building, how we can exploit and benefit from the location in Gorky Park, an unbelievably beautiful view both in the kind of winter and the summer, and how we can represent in this effort also significant elements, not only of previous histories of Russia and the Soviet Union, but also almost the history of its decay and the history of the building itself. So in order to maintain as much as possible and to intervene as little as possible, we decided to wrap the entire building in polycarbonate, which is a beautiful material because it insulates against the weather, but it still leaves a kind of relationship between inside and outside, so that this view, which is the current view, will be kind of modified and made kind of more mysterious to the material itself, but you will, in the museum, always feel what the nature of the outside is, and outside you will always get a sense of what is happening in the museum. And all of that is lifted off the ground to make the ground kind of more accessible. And we use this thickness, depth of the skin to also put all the surfaces in that skin, so that we don't compromise or tamper with the museum itself and the spaces itself, and treat it almost like a found object. Here see it in the day and here in the night. Inside we will do as little as possible, kind of maintain the spaces as they are, maintain also where possible the decoration, and we benefit from a kind of pavilion which is already there again to inject all the other functions that are necessary. So basically it's a block of space with inside it a kind of block of dense facilities, with here a restaurant which we will also choose furniture of the kind of history of Russia in the 20th century and kind of resurrect, so that the furniture also in itself acquires a quality of a museum. We have a very interesting client, as you know, and we've been able to discuss with them that we could maybe even kind of use the walls, partly as they are, to expose kind of paintings and to get kind of intersections and interactions between wall Russian history and paintings hung on it, which for me also is of course a very interesting episode in a campaign against the white cube and all its limitations. So here you see the building, there's only one intervention, important intervention. We cut out a kind of piece and make the skin there lift as a kind of billboard to create one exceptional intervention, and significantly that intervention is not to create another thing, but to eliminate and to create a kind of emptiness inside the building. Thank you very much.
my thinking about Garage Museum and what you're giving us, which is an incredible proposition, connects the way of thinking about architecture as a script and architecture dealing with the imaginary and the imagination, or the kind of literary aspects, to the reality of people, of kind of lived experiences, and to something that you're going to walk into. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what a museum means for you in that respect.
Well, I think that there's maybe no domain that is has changed more or is constantly changing than the kind of museum. And of course, it's almost inevitable that an architect is interested in art. Some of my best friends are artists or curators. So it's a kind of world that on the one hand I feel very close to, but on the other hand I sometimes see that the kind of pressure that has existed on architects through the market economy to become increasingly spectacular is also kind of working on the art world, increasingly large and increasingly exceptional, or increasingly forced to produce art that kind of can occupy those enormous spaces. So in that sense, it is wonderful to be involved in a museum which is not too big. I think it's a wonderful scale, and in that wonderful scale I think that we will kind of be able to recapture an experience that, as I mentioned, in kind of Museum of Modern Art, you simply cannot have anymore. There is no intimacy in such a kind of museum, and basically every pocket is exposed to the larger view and the larger implication. And so I see it as a kind of modest act of resistance maybe, or a very interesting fluke that Dasha picked this site, and that enables us to regain, for me, some of the kind of qualities of the museum, which is, of course, there are only two qualities in the museum. One of them is that you can see a work of art in a direct way without being bothered by other people, and on the other hand, a space where you can think about other things than daily life.
So, questions. Let's see whose hands go up. There you go, there. To listen to them.
You've showed pictures of the Palace of Soviet, classic project of Boris Yevhan, and as architect, could you imagine how would change the situations of Moscow nowadays if this project would exist now?
Well, I think that I think that Moscow is a city with enough Stalinism as it is. So I don't see that it would have been a kind of huge difference. There are the kind of Seven Sisters, and they, of course, create a kind of real. They have influenced the city as a whole, and I think personally that the strategy to surround the city by these kind of outposts has been, on the whole, interesting in terms of giving a kind of identity. I think that in retrospect, it's probably a good thing for the city that that particular monument does not exist, because it was at a scale and of a nature exclusively dedicated to a particular regime, that you're probably lucky that you don't have to take the decision whether to destroy it or to keep it. So I think you escaped beautifully. On the other hand, in a different context, in the context of Berlin, I've been quite active and quite unsuccessful in helping a particular section of the Berlin population to provide arguments for the maintenance of the former East Berlin Parliament, the Palace of the Republic, which again was not a particularly beautiful building, and which was put crudely in a very beautiful part of Berlin next to the Altes Museum, where I also felt it was crazy to eliminate a building that explained so much about the condition of Berlin. So I think that evil buildings or ugly buildings or failed buildings, all in certain conditions would have a right to exist. But I'm also happy for myself that I wouldn't have to argue for the monument to the Third International.
Another question?
Thank you for your lecture, it was very interesting. I wanted to ask you about your concept of generic city. Generic city is something very rational, but there is sacred architecture which is irrational. 95% of non-function and 5% of function, like an Egyptian pyramid. So don't you think that sacred architecture is something that escapes this generic city?
Can I ask you simply to repeat your question? Because I'm not sure, did you say generic or simply repeat it?
I wanted to ask you about the concept of generic city. Generic city is something very rational, and that is where it comes from. And religious architecture, sacred architecture, is 95% irrational, because, well, you want to contain, well, heights of cathedrals, etc. So don't you think that sacred architecture is something that escapes this concept?
Yeah. I think that basically, as part of my kind of research, I was writing, and the research, and that is basically perhaps my whole, how I have seen my role in architecture, is to eliminate prejudices and to intervene in the profession of architecture and in the whole kind of sensibility of architecture, which has been kind of for a very long time totally dominated by Western values, and which certainly kind of at the moment that I started to be active in this kind of world, was deeply convinced that there was only kind of one kind of city, that was the kind of European Western kind of city, that was the only model that kind of generated the conditions of urbanity, and that was completely convinced that there were no other models. And so I was interested in the beginning to actually say, yes, maybe there are no other models, but there are certainly other cities that work, that are cities, and that have nothing to do with the kind of aesthetic of the kind of European city. So that's why I went to kind of look at China, look at America, and look at Africa, and simply described all these different cities. But at some point I realized that kind of insisting always on the differences was very exhausting, and that I could also kind of write the last word on cities, and that's why I wrote the generic cities, and that was simply to describe the kind of city that emerges at this moment, dictated by the market economy more than by ideology, by aesthetics, or by values, and that kind of simply, that is what we are currently producing, whether we are, you know, Russians or Chinese or even Europeans, so it's not a kind of proposition. It's not a statement of agreeing with them. It's not a kind of perverse form of idealism. I was simply kind of reporting on this condition. And of course, there's nothing sacred about it, but I think there's very little sacred about our times. And so therefore, I certainly don't deny the necessity for more elevated ideas and concepts and buildings, but somehow we don't seem to be capable of kind of generating them, even with the best of intentions. And on the other hand, again in the Biennale in Venice, there is kind of in a section dedicated to Italy, a very interesting outcome of this current condition, where Sikhs, kind of Indian kind of people, that are actually inhabiting large parts of the Italian countryside and kind of small villages, are turning a found parking lot in a historical village into a Hindu temple. So I think the everyday practice of the sacred still occurs, but not in spaces that are originally designed for it.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
I have 2 questions, very simple. You mentioned you mentioned emptiness several times. In what terms? In terms psychological or mental or space, or just the combination? That is the first one. And could I see the second? 60s, the architecture of the 60s, for us, for Russia, is very important, is still important, and is still function. And it's very recognizable, I mean the environment, yeah? And not only in Moscow, and not especially in Moscow, but especially in provincial, yeah? In province. But could you compare, for what other countries in the world is it still important, or where is exception?
Okay.
Yeah? Thanks.
So emptiness, you asked me, is it, you named a number of categories, and I would say it's important in all those categories. Basically, spaces that are empty are less of a burden, they ask less attention, they are less complex, and so in certain cases I think it enables you to kind of almost meditate kind of around them. And so that is one part of the observation. The other part is that today it is so hellishly complex to kind of realize either a kind of urban environment or an individual building into an urban environment with all the kind of rules and all the regulations, but also the economy, etc. That the beauty of emptiness is that there are no rules, and there's also no economy of emptiness, and so that it is also paradoxically a domain that has a great future. So it's a kind of combination, really a combination of forces. I'm happy to ask that you asked a question about where is it still important. I would say it's everywhere still important, and of course in Russia it is important because a large part of the population lives in those accommodations, as you say, everywhere in the country. Tales of Communism is actually partly a description of the Soviet Union as a kind of an entity that kind of really was almost choreographing the entire country into a single coherent effort, and it's certainly impressive the scale of kind of realization of housing, and therefore, you know, kind of my insistence on recognizing the value of it is also to do with recognizing it for those who live in it, and emphasizing that there is a kind of certain value and aesthetic in it inherently. That is important in the terms of housing, but some of the other aspects of this issue is that in many capitalist or Western countries, it's exactly the socialist associations with that kind of architectural language which now provoke a kind of hatred. And it's not a kind of hatred with the elite, it's also a hatred with the politicians and a hatred with the public. And that is kind of why it really needs protection, because very often, like the restaurant here, it's a kind of architecture that is kind of generous, maybe not in terms of the individual apartments, but in terms of the kind of gestures toward the public, and more generous than kind of any contemporary architecture can be kind of financially. If you look at the conditions in the garage that you will discover in less than a year, you will see that there is a kind of waste of space that we currently almost cannot afford. So for those reasons, I defend it.
I would like to ask you about the museum. You showed that the walls are floating above the surface of the earth, and some parts of the walls are moving. So, as I understand, the space is cold inside, like outside.
No. Basically, I wasn't lifting the entire museum. The kind of museum is as it is on the ground, but instead of a facade which was opaque, there's simply a transparent facade on the ground floor, so that you can actually look in and out. But it's definitely kind of protected. And so this kind of up and down will only happen when the weather allows it, of course. Now it's completely climatized according to modern conditions. And that is also necessary for a contemporary museum, because if you don't, you cannot get any loans or any kind of any exchanges with the museum system.
Well, I would like also to ask, so can this building be perceived as only an illusion of the building, because you cannot find a shelter in there of any kind?
Well, I think that if everything goes according to the way I hope it, it will be both very present and very light. Because I thought Gorky Park is so nice, and we don't live in a kind of very monumental kind of period, so I thought that lightness and diffuseness is part of the effect I hope to achieve.
Thank you very much for your very, very personal lecture. And I would like to ask you a question which is very simple. Rem Koolhaas is a star architect, and we all, of course, admire your architecture and your buildings. But I have a very personal question. What do you like to do besides your architecture? Do you probably like traveling or meeting your friends or just walking in nature or reading books or what? What brings you to this powerful state of Rem Koolhaas architect? Thank you so much.
No, but it's a very good question, but I can assure you that I have a life beyond being an architect, but I'm not making any declarations about that life, because then I would kind of say goodbye to it. It's very crucial to have privacy, and I'm not going to tell anyone what my hobbies are or what I do in my spare time. I have spare time, and that's the limit of my disclosure.
Thank you. That was really very fascinating. Actually, my question was about the floating walls, but you've answered that. So my question is about the hexagonal building, very close to the restaurant. Are you going to work with that? Because I remember they said that that would be part of the museum too.
You're talking about the hexagon?
Yes.
Basically, yeah. Why don't you answer the question?
Well, at the moment, we're focusing on the fact that this building opens next year, and there are no plans for the hexagon in terms of what we're going to do with it at the moment. It's definitely in the future, and we have enough to work on right now.
Yeah, and I think that there's another kind of thing that nobody can say what is going to happen to the hexagon, because it's a technical situation. It's so complex, with a different degree of destruction in almost every pavilion, that before anything can be kind of done or thought or projected, it needs to be clear, kind of what is actually possible. So that is being investigated.
So I want to say two things before we wrap up. The first is that we welcome all of you to the new building in June next year. June 2015 is when it opens. So you will be hearing from us about that. And the second thing is much more immediate, which is that tonight, if you want to go and see the exhibitions that are on, we're keeping them open until 10 o'clock. So please do feel free to go and check out what's happening in Shiguruban in the exhibitions. And lastly, I want to say, Rem, thank you so much for your generosity, for explaining everything that you have tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.